A man's courage isn't measured by the fights he wins, but by the ground he refuses to surrender. The people of Sentinel Ridge still tell the story of the day Thomas Garrett stood on his porch and reminded 12 armed men that better souls than theirs had tried to take his land, and every last one was buried in the valley below. It was the autumn of 1891 when the trouble came to Sentinel Ridge. The town sat in a narrow valley where the Colorado Rockies began their climb toward the sky, a place where miners had once pulled silver from the earth until the veins ran dry and the companies moved on. What remained were families who'd sunk roots too deep to pull, ranchers who'd turned worked-out claims into grazing land, and a quiet main street where everybody knew everybody's business. Thomas Garrett was 73 that year, though you wouldn't know it watching him work his land. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints reminded him of every winter he'd survived, but his hands stayed steady and his eyes stayed sharp. The Garrett property, 200 acres of grassland and timber stretching up into the foothills, had been in his family since his father staked the claim in 1859. Thomas had been born in the cabin that still stood at the heart of it, had married Rebecca Flynn there in 1843, and had buried her beside the creek where aspens turned gold each fall. Their sons were gone now. Michael to a mining accident in 79, Daniel to pneumonia in 84. Both rested in the family plot on the hill overlooking the property, next to their mother and the grandfather they'd never known. Thomas lived alone, but he wasn't lonely. Every morning he walked the fence lines, checking for breaks. Every afternoon he rode out to move the cattle to fresh grazing. Every evening he sat on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the western peaks, smoking his pipe and remembering voices that had once filled the house behind him. The land knew him. The black gelding he'd raised from a colt knew the routes without guidance. The cattle recognized his whistle. The chickens came running when he stepped into the yard at dawn. It was a small kingdom, but it was his, purchased with a lifetime of sweat and grief and stubborn refusal to let go. He'd been a younger man once, a different man. The war had taken him east in 62, and he'd come back in 65 with skills he'd hoped never to use again and memories that still visited him on sleepless nights. 27 years of peace had followed. 27 years of building instead of destroying, of planting instead of burning. But there were men in the world who saw land differently than Thomas Garrett did. Men who looked at a valley and saw only numbers on a balance sheet. Lawrence Drummond was one of those men. Drummond owned the Colorado and Pacific Railroad, and he'd been buying up valley properties for 3 years, assembling a corridor for tracks that would connect Denver to the western mining camps. Most families had sold. The offers were generous, more money than a struggling ranch could make in 5 years. One by one, the for sale signs went up, the families loaded their wagons, and the land changed hands. Drummond's men had been to see Thomas 4 times. The first visit had been polite. The second had been insistent. The third had been accompanied by legal papers and implied consequences. The fourth had been 3 weeks ago, when a man named Cole Brennan had stepped onto Thomas's porch and suggested that accidents had a way of happening to people who didn't know when to take a generous offer. Thomas had told him the same thing he'd told the others. The land wasn't for sale at any price, and the next man who came threatening could test whether Thomas's hands had forgotten what they'd learned during the war. Cole Brennan hadn't come back, but on the morning of October 15th, 12 men rode up the valley road in a cloud of dust, and Thomas knew the conversation had moved past words. If you're enjoying this story of courage and conviction, please hit that like button and subscribe to Red Frontier, where we bring you true tales of the American West that changed how people understood what it means to stand for something. Thomas was in the barn when he heard the horses. He set down the harness he'd been mending and walked to the door, watching the riders approach. They came at a deliberate pace, strung out in a loose column, and every man wore a gun. Cole Brennan rode at the front. He was a big man gone soft around the middle, the kind who'd hired others to do his fighting for so long he'd forgotten how it felt to be the one at risk. The men behind him were harder, range toughs and drifters, the kind who'd work for any man who paid. Thomas walked to the porch and waited. He wore no gun belt, but his hunting rifle leaned against the doorframe, where it always did, and his hands hung relaxed at his sides. The riders stopped 20 feet from the porch. Cole Brennan dismounted with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no by someone who couldn't be bought or frightened. "Mr. Garrett," Brennan said, smiling like they were old friends. "Beautiful morning." "It was," Thomas replied. "Now, there's no need for hostility. Mr. Drummond sent me to make one final offer. $20,000 for your property. That's twice what anyone else got. You could live like a king in Denver on that kind of money." "I live like a king right here." Brennan's smile thinned. "You're being unreasonable. The railroad's coming through whether you sell or not. Eminent domain, Mr. Garrett. The territorial government will take your land for a fraction of what we're offering, and you'll get nothing but a court battle you can't afford to fight. Then I guess we'll find out what a judge thinks about a railroad man threatening an old veteran." The smile disappeared entirely. Brennan glanced back at his men, then returned his attention to Thomas with cold calculation in his eyes. "You think you're tough because you fought in the war? Look around, old man. There's 12 of us. You're alone. Nobody's going to ride up that valley to help you. Nobody even knows we're here." Thomas's voice didn't rise, but something in it changed, something that made 3 of the riders shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Better men than you have tried to take what's mine," he said quietly. "You want to know where they are? Start digging in the valley. You'll find them." It wasn't true. Thomas hadn't killed anyone since Appomattox. But Brennan didn't know that, and the old darkness in Thomas's eyes suggested a man who remembered exactly how to end a life and had made peace with doing it again, if necessary. Brennan's hand drifted toward his hip. "You threatening me?" "I'm answering your question. You asked if I thought I was tough. I'm telling you I know what I am. I know what you are. Now get off my land before we find out which one of us is right." For 5 seconds, nobody moved. The morning hung suspended between words and violence, balanced on the edge of a choice that once made couldn't be unmade. Then Brennan drew. He was slow. Soft living and expensive whiskey had taken the speed from his hands, and he telegraphed the move a full second before his fingers touched the grip. Thomas had already moved. His hand closed on the rifle, brought it up, and fired in one fluid motion that spoke of muscle memory carved into him 30 years ago. Bang! Brennan fell backward off the porch, a hole in his chest, dead before he hit the ground. For one frozen moment, the 11 remaining men stared at their fallen employer. Then chaos erupted. 3 men drew. Thomas worked the lever. Bang! The nearest rider toppled from his saddle. Bang! Another fell. The others scattered, reaching for weapons, spurring horses, shouting orders that no one followed. Thomas dropped behind the porch railing. Bullets chewed wood where he'd been standing. He rolled left, came up at the corner, fired. Bang! A man clutched his shoulder and dropped his pistol. For down. 8 remain. 2 riders charged the porch. Thomas fired twice in rapid succession. Bang! Bang! Both horses went down screaming, throwing their riders. 6 left. One of the thrown men staggered to his feet, raising a shotgun. Thomas put a round through his leg. 5 standing. 7 casualties. The remaining riders had taken cover behind a water trough and a hay wagon. Bullets spanged off the porch supports. Thomas stayed low, counting shots, tracking positions. These weren't professionals. They were panicking, firing wild, wasting ammunition. He aimed carefully at the water trough. Bang! The bullet punched through the wood. A man screamed and stumbled into the open, clutching his side. Thomas didn't fire again. The man fell on his own. For left. Anyone who rides out now can ride out whole. Thomas called. Anyone who stays dies here. There was frantic whispering behind the hay wagon. Then one man broke from cover, sprinting for his horse. Thomas let him go. The horse bolted down the valley road with its rider bent low over the saddle. 3 left. Another man threw down his gun and raised his hands, walking slowly into the open. I'm done. Don't shoot. Keep walking, Thomas ordered. Take a horse and go. The man didn't argue. 2 left. The last pair opened fire together, a desperate coordinated assault that sent splinters flying from the porch. Thomas counted their shots. 6, 7, 8. Click, click, empty. He stood and aimed at the hay wagon. Drop them and walk away, or I put rounds through that wagon until you can't walk at all. 10 seconds of silence. Then 2 pistols clattered onto the dirt, and 2 men emerged with hands raised. "Go," Thomas said. "Tell Drummond what happened here. Tell him what it costs to push a man too far." They went. Thomas stood on his porch as the sun climbed higher, smoke drifting from his rifle barrel, and looked at the carnage in his yard. 3 dead. For wounded badly enough, they weren't going anywhere. 5 fled. 12 men had come to take his land. 3 would never leave. He set the rifle down and walked among the wounded, checking injuries with the detached efficiency of a man who'd done battlefield triage. None would die if they got medical attention soon. He dragged the dead men into the shade of the barn. No sense leaving them in the sun, and then walked to the road and fired 3 shots into the air. The signal was old, left over from mining days. 3 shots meant trouble. Help needed. Within an hour, Sheriff Bill Hobbs rode up the valley with 2 deputies. He took one look at the scene and removed his hat, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Lord Almighty, Thomas." "What happened?" Thomas told him. The sheriff listened, occasionally glancing at the bodies, the wounded men, the bullet-scarred porch. "They drew first?" Hobbs asked. "Brennan drew first. I've got witnesses among the wounded, if they're honest. But yes, self-defense, Bill. 12-1, on my own property." Hobbs nodded slowly. "Drummond's going to raise hell. Drummond sent 12 men to murder me. He raises hell. I'll remind a territorial judge of that fact." The sheriff sent his deputies for the doctor and the undertaker. He questioned the wounded men, who confirmed Thomas's story with varying degrees of reluctance. Then he sat on the porch steps beside Thomas and stared at the mountains. "You know this isn't over," Hobbs said quietly. "I know. Drummond's got money, lawyers, connections in Denver. He could make your life very difficult. He can try." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's things you don't know, Thomas. Drummond's not just buying land for the railroad. He's been buying people. The territorial governors in his pocket. Half the judges. He's got a private army of enforcers who've been running families out of other valleys using tactics that make today look polite." Thomas turned to look at him. "You're saying the law won't protect me. I'm saying the law's got limits when money and power say otherwise. Brennan was small time. Drummond will send professionals next time. Former cavalry. Pinkerton men. People who do this for a living. Then I'll die on my land instead of in some Denver flop house. That's still a choice, Bill." The sheriff stood, putting his hat back on. "I'll file this as self-defense." "It is self-defense. But Thomas, consider what you're fighting for. Is 200 acres of dirt worth your life?" Thomas looked at the mountains, the creek, the aspen grove where Rebecca rested. "It's not dirt, Bill. It's every morning I woke up next to my wife. It's every time my boys laughed on that porch. It's my father's hands building that cabin. It's 30 years of peace I earned by surviving war. A man who won't fight for that isn't a man at all." The sheriff had no answer to that. He rode away an hour later with the prisoners and the dead, leaving Thomas alone on his porch as the sun sank toward evening. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, cleaning his rifle, remembering things he'd spent decades trying to forget. The weight of a weapon, the sound of men dying, the cold calculation required to kill efficiently. He'd been good at it once. Too good. The war had needed men like him, and he delivered what was asked until the day it ended and he'd sworn never again. But here he was, 3 men dead by his hand, more wounded, and the knowledge that Hobbs was right. This was only the beginning. The next morning, a rider came up the valley. Thomas watched him approach, rifle ready, but the man rode with hands visible and empty. He stopped at a respectful distance and called out, "Mr. Garrett, I'm not armed. I'm not with Drummond. I have news." Thomas stepped onto the porch. "Speak it from there. My name's Patrick Flynn. I'm a reporter for the Denver Post. Word reached us about what happened yesterday. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Thomas considered. "Why?" "Because Drummond's been pushing people around for years, and nobody's pushed back. That's news. That's a story people need to hear. I'm not looking for fame. I'm not offering it. I'm offering the truth. Drummond will spin this as a crazy old man murdering his employees. Let me print what really happened. Let people judge for themselves." Thomas thought about Rebecca, about his boys, about every family that had sold and left because they'd had no choice. Then he nodded. "Come up. I'll make coffee." Flynn stayed for 3 hours, taking notes, asking questions, photographing the bullet holes. He rode away with a story that would run on the front page 2 days later, complete with Thomas's quote, "A man's land is his soul. Anyone who tries to take it better be prepared to answer for that in blood or in court." I gave them the choice. The article made Thomas famous overnight. Letters poured in from across the territory. Other families being pushed out by corporate interests, veterans who understood what it meant to defend what you'd bled for, people who were tired of watching money crush principle. The territorial governor made a public statement condemning this senseless violence and calling for Thomas's arrest. Sheriff Hobbs politely informed the governor that self-defense wasn't a crime and that any arrest warrant would need to survive judicial scrutiny, which, given the witnesses and circumstances, it wouldn't. Drummond said nothing publicly. But on October 23rd, 8 days after the first confrontation, a telegram arrived in Sentinel Ridge addressed to Sheriff Hobbs. It was terse and threatening. "Garrett matter will be resolved. Railroad comes through. Drummond." Hobbs brought the telegram to Thomas that afternoon. They sat on the porch, watching storm clouds build over the peaks. "He's going to send more men," Hobbs said. "Better men. I know. You can't fight an army, Thomas. Maybe not, but I can make it expensive enough that he gives up. Or you die trying." Thomas smiled without humor. "There are worse ways to go than defending your home, Bill." The sheriff left. Thomas sat alone as the first drops of rain began to fall, and he wondered if he'd see another autumn. The answer came 3 days later, when a wagon rolled into town carrying a man Thomas hadn't seen in 28 years. Samuel Carter had served in Thomas's company during the war. A sergeant, clever and deadly, the kind of man who could plan an ambush or lead a charge with equal competence. He'd gone west after Appomattox and made a name as a bounty hunter, then as a lawman, then as a security consultant for mining companies. Now he walked into the general store where Thomas was buying supplies, and the two men locked eyes across 30 feet of floorboards and decades of memory. "Tom," Samuel said quietly. "Sam, heard you had some trouble. Nothing I couldn't handle." Samuel approached slowly, hands visible and relaxed. "That's what I heard. Also heard Drummond's hired the Kincaid brothers. You know that name?" Thomas's jaw tightened. Everyone knew the Kincaids. Former Union cavalry officers who'd turned their wartime skills into a business. They specialized in what they called property dispute resolution, a polite term for terrorizing families into selling. They were efficient, ruthless, and had never failed to deliver what they were paid for. "When?" Thomas asked. "They're in Denver now, drumming up a crew, maybe 20 men, all professionals. I'd guess they'll move in about a week. You here to warn me or join them?" Samuel's face hardened. "I'm here because we rode together. Because you pulled me out of Shiloh when I took that bayonet. Because some things matter more than money. I'm here to stand with you." Thomas studied his old friend. "You know how this ends. Same way it always ended. We stand and fight, or we run and die ashamed. I'm too old to run, Tom." That night, they sat on the porch and talked the way only old soldiers can, speaking in references to battles and brothers long dead, understanding without explanation what it meant to face impossible odds. "We'll need help," Samuel said. 20 professionals against 2 old men isn't a fight. It's a massacre. The town won't get involved. Drummond owns the mayor. I'm not talking about the town. I'm talking about the people Drummond's been pushing. The families who sold because they were scared. They see you standing, some of them might find their backbone. Or they might stay home and keep their heads down. Only one way to find out. The next day, they rode into Sentinel Ridge together. At the church, they called a meeting. 40 people showed up, ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, families who'd lived in the valley for generations. Thomas stood at the front and told them the truth. Drummond was coming, with professional killers, in overwhelming numbers, to take what he wanted by force because the law had failed and money had won. "I'm not asking you to fight," Thomas said. "I'm not asking you to risk your lives or your families. I'm only asking that you remember what this valley used to be before men like Drummond decided we didn't matter. I'm asking you to remember what it felt like to own something that was yours, earned by your hands, not given by his mercy." He paused, looking at faces he'd known for decades. "I'm an old man. I've got no children to leave this land to. but I'll be damned if I give it up to a bully who thinks my life is worth less than his profit. So I'm going to stand, alone if I have to. But if any man here wants to remind Drummond that we're not cattle to be herded, you're welcome on my land when they come." The church was silent. Then a young rancher named Paul Hendricks stood. "My father sold last year, took Drummond's money and drank himself to death because he couldn't live with the shame. I'll stand with you, Mr. Garrett." An old miner named Josiah Webb stood next. "Lost my claim to Drummond's legal tricks. Never got a fair price. I'll stand." One by one, men rose. Not all of them. Maybe a third stayed seated, fear or pragmatism keeping them still. But when the count was done, 14 men had volunteered. 14 civilians and 2 old soldiers against 20 professionals. Samuel looked at Thomas and shrugged. "I've faced worse odds. Name one time." "Can't, but I like the sound of it." They had 6 days to prepare. Samuel knew tactics. He walked the property, identifying fields of fire, choke points, defensive positions. They dug rifle pits on the high ground overlooking the house. They built barricades from fence rails and overturned wagons. They stocked ammunition and medical supplies. The volunteers trained. Most could shoot. This was ranching country, but shooting targets was different from shooting men. Samuel ran them through drills, teaching them to aim low, to fire in volleys, to stay calm when bullets were coming back. Thomas watched a shopkeeper named William practice reloading, his hands shaking so badly he dropped cartridges in the dirt. He knelt beside the man. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said gently. William looked up, tears in his eyes. "My daughter asked me last week why we let bad men take our home. I didn't have an answer, Mr. Garrett. Maybe I'll die here, but at least I'll die with an answer." On the 6th day, a rider brought word. The Kincaids had left Denver. 23 men, heavily armed, moving fast. They'd be at Sentinel Ridge by dawn. That night, Thomas gathered the men in his house. They were scared, some trying to hide it, some wearing it openly. Samuel stood beside Thomas, solid and calm, and began assigning positions. "We don't try to hold everything," he explained. "We funnel them into kill zones. The house is our strong point. Rifle pits on the flanks. When they commit, we hit them from 3 sides. Make every shot count. Don't waste ammunition on suppression fire." He looked at each man in turn. "Some of you won't see tomorrow night. That's the truth. But if we stand together, if we fight smart, we can hurt them badly enough that Drummond thinks twice about the cost. That's victory. Not walking away clean, but making them bleed for every inch." The men dispersed to their positions. Thomas stood on his porch one last time, looking at the stars, thinking about Rebecca and his boys and the life he'd built. Samuel joined him. "Having second thoughts? Always do before a fight. Never stopped me yet. You think we'll win? I think we'll make them remember us." They shook hands, and Samuel went to check the positions one final time. Thomas stayed on the porch, pipe in hand, watching the valley where he'd been born. Somewhere in that darkness, 23 men were coming to take everything from him. But they'd find him ready. They'd find him standing. And whatever happened when the sun rose, he'd go down on his own terms. The dawn came cold and clear. Thomas watched it from the rifle pit on the East Ridge. Samuel beside him, 14 frightened but determined men spread across defensive positions that had been chosen with care and built with desperation. At 7 o'clock, the Kincaids rode into view. They came in formation, no wild charge, no reckless assault. These were professionals. They approached the property in a skirmish line, spread wide, using cover, moving with the discipline of men who'd done this before. At the center rode 2 men who could only be the Kincaid brothers. Both wore cavalry hats and long dusters. Both sat their horses like they owned the world. They stopped at 300 yards. One of the brothers, the older one, gray showing in his beard, called out in a voice trained to carry across battlefields. "Thomas Garrett, my name is Colonel Richard Kincaid. We have been retained by the Colorado and Pacific Railroad to secure this property. You have until noon to vacate. Anyone remaining will be removed by force. This is your only warning." Thomas stood from the rifle pit. Samuel tried to pull him down, but he shrugged off the hand and called back. "This is my land. It was my father's land. It'll be my grave before it's your railroad. You want it, Colonel. You're welcome to try taking it. But you'll pay for every foot in blood. Kincaid studied him through binoculars for a long moment. Then he lowered them and turned to his men, issuing orders Thomas couldn't hear. Here we go, Samuel muttered, checking his rifle. The Kincaids didn't charge. They dismounted, taking cover behind rocks and trees, and began a methodical advance. This wasn't a gunfight. This was a siege. The first shots came at 7:15. Kincaid's men opened fire on the house, not trying to hit anyone, just testing the defenses, learning where the return fire came from. Samuel ordered the defenders to hold. Don't give away positions. Let them commit. The professionals advanced in bounds, one group firing while another moved, textbook tactics. They reached 200 yards, 150, 100. Now, Samuel shouted. 14 rifles opened fire from 3 sides. The Kincaid's men, caught in a crossfire they hadn't expected, went to ground. Bullets kicked up dirt around them. One man fell, clutching his leg. Another took a round through the shoulder and crawled for cover. The professionals returned fire with devastating accuracy. Bullets chewed through the rifle pit walls. One of the defenders, a young rancher named Paul, took a round through the chest and fell without a sound. 13 left. The battle became chaos. Thunder rolled across the valley as both sides poured lead at muzzle flashes and shadows. Thomas fired, reloaded, fired again, the motion's automatic muscle memory from a war that felt both distant and immediate. A group of Kincaid's men tried to flank left. Samuel saw them coming and redirected fire. Left pit. 3 men moving your way. Don't let them get to cover. The defenders in the left pit opened up. Bang, bang, bang. One attacker went down. The other 2 retreated. 21 left standing. But Kincaid was smart. He'd brought too many men. While the defenders focused on the flanking attempt, the center advanced. They reached the barn and took cover behind it. They're going to burn us out, someone shouted. Thomas saw it too. From the barn, they had clear access to the house. They'd torch it, forcing the defenders into the open. Sam, he called. We need to retake the barn. Samuel looked at the distance, the cover, the angles. Suicide run. You got a better idea? Samuel grinned, and for a moment he was 30 years younger, planning desperate charges against impossible odds. Not a 1. On 3. On 3. They counted together, burst from the rifle pit, and sprinted toward the barn with bullets snapping past them like angry hornets. Thomas felt something tug at his sleeve. Something else burned across his ribs. He kept running. They reached the barn wall. Samuel kicked in the door and went through firing. Bang! Bang! 2 men fell. Thomas came behind him, rifle blazing. Bang! The third attacker dove out the back window. They held the barn. But the cost was clear. Thomas was bleeding from his side, and Samuel had taken a round through his left arm. We're getting too old for this, Samuel gasped, reloading one-handed. Should have thought of that 6 days ago. The fight raged for another hour. The Kincaids pressed hard, using superior numbers and firepower, but the defenders made them pay for every advance. Bodies lay in the dirt on both sides. The smell of gunpowder hung thick and acrid. At 8:30, Colonel Kincaid called a ceasefire. Both sides stopped shooting. In the sudden silence, the wounded could be heard, groaning, crying, calling for help. Kincaid stood in the open, hands visible. Garrett, you made your point. You're willing to die. We respect that. But this is over. We got 15 men still fighting. You got what, 8? Maybe 9? Surrender now, and you live. Keep fighting, and we end this the hard way. Thomas stepped out from the barn, ignoring Samuel's curse. He was bleeding, exhausted, but his voice carried steady and clear. You came here to take my land. You've lost 6 men doing it. How many more can you afford before Drummond decides you're not worth the cost? How many more before this stops being business and starts being murder? Because I'm old, Colonel, and I'm bleeding, but I can still pull a trigger. And every man here would rather die standing than live kneeling. Behind him, in the rifle pits and barricades, the surviving defenders stood. Thomas counted them. 9. 9 men still able to fight, against 15 professionals. Kincaid stared at them for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "You're right. This has gone past business. But I'm a soldier, Garrett, not a murderer. If you want to settle this the old way, you and me, single combat, winner takes all, I'll do that. Save the lives of everyone else still breathing." Samuel grabbed Thomas's arm. "Don't. It's a trap." But Thomas saw the exhaustion in Kincaid's eyes, the bodies of his men in the dirt, the mathematics of a fight where winning would still mean losing half his force. "One condition," Thomas called back. "We both survive, or we both die. The fight ends. No retaliation against the town. No revenge against my men." "Agreed. On my honor as an officer." Thomas handed his rifle to Samuel. "If I lose, you won't. If I lose, take the men and leave. Don't die for pride, Sam." He walked out into the open ground between the barn and Kincaid's position. The colonel did the same. 60 feet separated them. Both men's hands hovered near their pistols. "Your move, Colonel," Thomas said. They drew together. Bang! Bang! Thomas felt the bullet hit him, a hammer blow to the left shoulder that spun him halfway around. But his shot had flown true. Kincaid fell backward, blood spreading across his chest. Both men lay in the dirt. The defenders started to move, but Samuel held them back. Slowly, painfully, Kincaid sat up. He looked at the hole in his chest, then at Thomas, who was struggling to rise with one arm useless. "Good shooting," Kincaid said, his voice wet and labored. "For an old man." "You too," Thomas replied. Kincaid's brother ran to him, followed by his men. They lifted him carefully. The younger Kincaid looked at Thomas with hate and calculation. "The deal stands," the wounded colonel said. "We're done. Tell Drummond. Tell him this land's not worth what it cost." They carried him to a wagon. The surviving professionals gathered their dead and wounded and rode out, leaving Thomas bleeding in the dirt and Samuel rushing to his side. The battle was over. 9 defenders had survived. 8 of Kincaid's men were dead, 7 wounded badly. The property looked like a war zone. Buildings riddled with bullet holes, blood in the dirt, smoke hanging in the air. But the land was still Thomas Garrett's. The doctor came from town. He patched Thomas and Samuel and the wounded defenders with practiced efficiency. The shoulder wound was serious but not fatal. Thomas would heal. That night, as the valley fell silent, Sheriff Hobbs arrived with a telegram. It was from Lawrence Drummond himself, brief and bitter. "Railroad will route north. Property acquisition terminated." Drummond. They'd won. The news spread fast. Papers across the territory picked up the story. The Denver Post ran it on the front page. "Veteran stands against corporate army. Railroad backs down." Letters poured in from families who'd been pushed around by powerful interests, people who'd given up fighting and now wondered if they should have stood. The surviving defenders became local legends. Some left the valley, unable to shake the memory of violence. Others stayed, finding that they discovered something about themselves in that desperate stand. Samuel recovered and stayed on as Thomas's partner, helping run the property that had cost so much to defend. Thomas healed slowly. The shoulder never worked quite right again, and the nightmares from the war returned with reinforcements from newer ghosts. But he was alive. He was free, and the land was still his. He lived 7 more years. In that time, he watched the railroad route north through the mountains, adding miles and cost to avoid the valley where an old man had reminded them that some things couldn't be bought. He watched Sentinel Ridge grow as families who'd left began coming back, inspired by the knowledge that standing against power was possible. He watched his property become profitable again as cattle prices rose and new markets opened. But mostly, he watched the seasons turn from his porch, pipe in hand, thinking about Rebecca and his boys and the morning when he'd chosen to stand rather than surrender. In the spring of 1898, Thomas Garrett died peacefully in his sleep. He was 80 years old. The funeral drew people from across the territory. Former defenders came, older now, but standing straight as they carried the casket. Families he'd never met came to honor a man who'd shown them what courage looked like. Even Sheriff Hobbs, retired now, came to say goodbye to his friend. They buried Thomas on the hill overlooking his property, next to Rebecca and his sons. The headstone read, Thomas Garrett, 1818 to 1898, he stood his ground. Samuel spoke at the funeral, his voice carrying over the crowd gathered among the aspens. Tom used to say that a man's courage isn't measured by the fights he wins, but by the ground he refuses to surrender. He stood here when it would have been easier to leave. He fought when it would have been safer to fold. And because he did, a lot of us found the strength to stand for what we believed in. That's not just courage. That's legacy. The property stayed in the family. A distant cousin claimed it and ran it as a working ranch for another 40 years. Eventually, it was donated to the territorial government and became a historic site, preserved as a reminder of the day when ordinary people pushed back against extraordinary power. The rifle pits are still there, weathered but visible. So are the bullet holes in the barn. And on clear mornings when the light hits the valley just right, you can almost see it. An old man on a porch, smoking his pipe, watching over land he bled to protect. The story of Thomas Garrett's stand became legend. But unlike most legends, this one was true. Every word of it. And it changed how people in that valley thought about what it meant to have courage, to stand for principle, to refuse to back down even when the odds were impossible and the cost was almost certain death. Because at the end of it all, Thomas Garrett understood something that Lawrence Drummond never could. Some things matter more than money, more than comfort, more than survival itself. Sometimes the ground you stand on is worth dying for. And the man who understands that can never truly be defeated. So when you find yourself backed into a corner, when the powerful tell you to surrender what you've built, remember the old veteran on his porch in Sentinel Ridge. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to stand anyway. Remember that one person willing to fight can inspire a dozen others to find their backbone. And remember that the land we defend isn't just dirt and grass. It's every sacrifice made to claim it, every memory built upon it, every principle we refuse to compromise to keep it. That's Thomas Garrett's lesson. That's what he died to teach us. The question is, are we still listening? If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Over at Red Frontier, we bring you true tales of courage and conviction from the American West, stories that remind us what it means to stand for something bigger than ourselves. Until next time, remember, the most important ground you'll ever defend is the ground beneath your own feet.